Hello, I'm Chuck Fall, and my two guests are members of the Green Party. I am a media activist working for the Truth Action Project. Today, we will shed light on the dark truth about our money supply and the role the banking cartels play in it. TAP, Truth Action Project, is dedicated to advancing political truth. We report on all the big lies, JFK to 9/11, to the banking crisis, to now the federal COVID response, and more. But today, we are talking about our money supply. What is the truth? Welcome, Howard Switzer and Rita Jacobs. You are co-chairs of the Green Party U.S. Banking and Monetary Reform Committee, and you are strong proponents for monetary and banking reform. And we're going to talk about that today. I'm going to start with Rita, and I'd like you to, and we'll go to each of you, Rita, and then Howard. And for starters, would you each give a brief introduction about how it is you became members of the Green Party and explain how the committee supports the work of the Green Party National Committee and what role you play in advancing policy? Rita, please give us an introduction.
I guess we started this committee about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, and basically, we had in our platform monetary reform, and before this committee was started, and the committee was formed primarily to promote that part of our platform that it had been virtually neglected, I would say. And most of the Green Party members don't understand anything about monetary reform. So that's basically why our committee exists.
And then what got you involved into the Green Party, and when did that happen?
I joined the Green Party in 2015. And I joined mainly because I've been a lifelong anti-war activist. And the Green Party was the only party that has peace in its platform. So it was a no-brainer but I also agree with all of the other main pillars of the Green Party.
Cool. And you said Jill Stein was an inspiration for you to plug into the Green Party.
Yes.
Okay. Very good. So Howard, very briefly, just give us some background. What brought you into the Green Party, and what got you engaged as co-chair now of the Banking and Monetary Reform Committee?
Well, I was in kind of like the permaculture movement and doing natural building, teaching natural building and straw bale construction, things like that. And but I had always been interested in the politics and watching the politics. It just seemed like we needed to organize a Green Party. And so back in the 90s in Tennessee, there was a number of us talking about that. We weren't able to really pull anything together until 2000 when Ralph ran, and that got some excitement and some attention to the Green Party. And so we were able to form our party then, just before the National Party organized GPUS, which I had participated in as well. And so you could say I'm a founding member of GPUS and GP of Tennessee.
Well, welcome. I'm very happy to be with you today and proud of your history and kind of commitment to this cause. Tennessee does have ballot access. Is that correct?
No.
Okay, and that's a hard row to hoe, isn't it, to get that ballot status?
We didn't have any ballot roadblocks at all in 1961 and prior to that. But when the George Wallace was running, and the racism kind of scared people, and so they the Democrats came in and made a bunch of rules about who could get on the ballot.
Oh,
basically, it was a signature requirement that was odious. It was way heavy. You had to pretty much be a political party to get it. And so we had a very hard time doing that. So I ran for office a couple of times as governor and just to establish our position to sue the state for their ballot access laws.
Clever.
And we managed to, we won 4 decisions in federal court, but then they changed judges on us on the last appeal of the state, and they threw it out.
You're a warrior, Howard, going into the courts on behalf of the Green Party and the movement.
Yeah,
Bravo.
it was exciting.
Yeah. Okay. So let's stay with you, Howard. I'm going to ask you what's wrong with the money supply as it's currently configured. And I'm going to ask that you're going to distinguish publicly owned money supply from a privately owned one. Give us a historical snapshot of what is the issue.
Well, the issue is sovereignty, basically. And a nation is sovereign if they issue their own money and control their own resources, et cetera, for their people. And of course, we haven't seen any of those for quite a long time, really. Mm-hmm. And that's because early on, back in the 1600s, banks, which were goldsmiths back then, and who were taking in deposits of gold and holding that in safe keeping and issuing a receipt for it. And that receipt began to be used as money. It had the amount on it, right? And so they could trade those receipts for money, and the banks figured out that, hey, we could probably issue receipts without any gold on deposit and nobody would be the wiser. And so they started doing that. That was kind of the beginning of what we call today fractional reserve banking. And so anyway, that power eventually, accumulation of money, of course, is power. Aristotle pointed that out. I said there was 2 roles of money. One was as a medium of exchange. The other was an instrument of power. And of course, it's accumulated money that's power. And with that power, you can manipulate markets, dominate a market. You can buy an industry, which they did. And as the Pujo Committee proved, that the banks controlled all the industries in the country, and no law or anything has ever been made to change that. And so that's where we are today. We have a privatized monetary system. And of course, the American Revolution was a battle to get out from under the Bank of England's corporate money system, which was imposed on the colonies by the corporation from what they call the East India Corporation. And the colonies had developed their own money. And so they were having a prosperous time for a good while with issuing their own money. And it took them a couple hundred years to figure it out too, because they really didn't have any money. And they depended.
The fact that the colonial Americans were producing their own money gave them the sovereignty over their money. And that's the critical thing, because if you don't, quote, own your own money and have that sovereignty, then you're going to be, in effect, borrowing your money. I mean, is that the distinction?
So that is a distinction, but they had, that's what the revolution was about, to get out from under England so that they could issue their own money. And of course, that's what the people wanted. But the American aristocracy, in the post-war struggle, power struggle among the aristocrats and those in Congress, ended up handing our monetary authority over to a private bank that Hamilton's friend owned.
Governor Morris, is that who it was?
Yeah. Well, not Governor Morris, but William Morris. Governor Morris was more of a, he was on, I think, more on their side than Robert Morris. Robert Morris, it was the banker in New York. But the Continental was issued to fund the revolution. by the Continental Congress because, of course, they couldn't borrow money from the Bank of England. They were fighting against them.
Okay.
And so they issued the Continentals, and they issued 250 million, I think, in Continentals. But the British, who understood how to make monetary war because they'd done it before, started manufacturing counterfeit Continentals by the millions
Oh my.
and
So
flooded
that's
the market. And that lowered the value of the Continental over a 5-year period to the point where at the end of the 5-year period, it was hardly worth anything. But we had already won militarily pretty much by then. And so we won militarily, but lost monetarily, basically.
so let me just and we're gonna get to Rita in a moment because we're gonna talk about an article she wrote at Covert Action, and we're gonna talk about the Peugeot Committee. But in between the colonial, War of Independence and the Civil War, because I'm gonna ask you to talk about the greenbacks in the Civil War. But in between, there's a whole rich history of kind of struggle between who owns the bank.
That's right.
Just give us a couple of historical nuggets and bring us up to greenbacks and just fill in that time in between. And I know Andrew Jackson figures in prominently here as president.
Yeah. Andrew Jackson, he banned the banks from creating money, from doing their scam, because they had, there was so much complaint from the people about how the banks were cheating them. And so Jackson banned them from doing it. But his mistake was he didn't understand money. And so he didn't issue government money to fill the gap. No money. No, when the banks aren't lending, there's no money. And so he didn't fill the gap with government money. And consequently, we had a 10-year depression.
And so that's the lesson of the greenback. I mean, the North was fighting the South, and they didn't, and the Bank of England favored the South over the North. So there was a problem of getting money.
They feared the United States. They feared that the United States would become an economic superpower. And of course,
they are. Well, so then how did the greenback figure in? What was that? That was another example of sovereign.
Right. And that was when the Civil War began. We were attacked by the South. Lincoln wanted to defend the nation. When he talked to the banks, they wouldn't lend him any money except at exorbitant interest rates. And he refused to do that. And among his associates, a friend pointed out that the government could issue its own money.
And this is constitutionally based.
That we could coin our own money. And so that's what they did. And again, the greenback was, issued in a limited amount of money to fund the revolution. And they printed it with green ink and with complex designs to kind of keep counterfeiting from happening. And so they didn't have that problem to deal with so much.
Okay, Howard, that was a snapshot in time, a brief history. We covered, I think there's probably a whole bunch of really thick books that have discussed all of this.
There's the whole progressive movement from the Civil War on to the turn of the century. That was a struggle for, and political parties pushing for public money all through that time.
And so our conversation right now actually has quite a bit of history to it, and it hasn't. And so in effect, you're kind of hearkening back to a struggle 100 years ago that never got resolved and remains something hanging over our nation, as it were.
Right.
Okay, so now we're going to shift here, because I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to choose this one. Can you see my Covert Action magazine?
Yeah.
And this is a really fantastic article that our own here, right here, Rita Jacobs, wrote October 2022, very recent. And this will be hyperlinked. It'll be available on the YouTube post where people can see our interview right now. And we're going to talk about some of these details. This is the article is identifying the enemy is the first step in winning the war. It is a call to action. And so Rita, we're going to ask you to just give us a summary of the key historic events, and you're going to bring us up to the work of the Pujo Committee. What a name, and who's ever heard of them? But this is actually an important historical piece of business that we should all be aware of. So I'm just going to just do a quick scroll. Great representation. And perhaps you'll talk about the spread of the censorship and the propaganda that we are contending with as we have our conversation. And there's an issue of centralization of power. And we're going to jump in. There they are. There is the Pujo Committee. Rita, give us some background. I'm going to stop sharing and we'll just focus on ourselves here, but this is a really wonderful article. Great background. What are you doing in this piece of journalism?
First of all, I'm trying to help people understand that we do have a common enemy here. And basically it's the entire banking system.
Okay.
And so in order to get up to that thought, I have a lot of background about what went on prior to the time that we had the Federal Reserve Act passed in 1913. And
well, wait, let me interrupt you. So let's just jump back. So basically, after the Civil War, Howard just introduced the progressive movement. There's also a populist movement going on. Something is leading up to the Pujo Committee at the early 1900s now. So something developed that caused them to convene. What happened in all of that time before?
Well, during that same period of time, we had a lot of expansion going on in the country. We had millions of immigrants coming in, and the banks basically were funding all of these new projects, the railroads and the telecommunication systems and industry and everything else that was going on. And it started to become rather common knowledge that these banks had a lot of power, and that there was a lot of concentration of power within just a few individuals who were running the country, and to the exclusion or trying to exclude other businesses or whatever from starting up in the meantime.
And these produce antitrust battles between the federal government and Standard Oil, the Rockefeller concern. Is that correct?
Yes, that did feature or enter into this controversy. And by 1904, the newspapers were distributing I guess a graphic or whatever that showed the interaction of the banks with these various other industries that were going on in the large corporations. And they broke it down into two sectors. One was the Rockefeller family sector, and the other was J.P. Morgan, and showed how they were basically controlling all of the industry and corporations that were doing business in the U.S. over that period of time. And so they were well aware of this power of the bankers by 1904, and in 1912 they established a congressional committee, and this was part of the House Committee on Banking and Currency, I think they called it then. and they formed a subcommittee to do an investigation, and it was headed up by our son Peugeot, who was a representative from Louisiana.
Hmm.
That's why it's called the Peugeot Committee.
After him, named after the
Yes,
leader.
you're right. And anyway, they did an investigation for several months of the banks, and had the bankers come in and testify before Congress. And at some point, yeah, they drew up a big chart that showed the interconnection of all of the banks with the various industries and corporations. And you're showing that chart right here that was drawn up by the Peugeot Committee. Of course, back then they didn't have computers to help them do these things, so I presume it was a lot of work in getting this chart together.
Well, let me just, since you have it on, that, thanks for sharing, Howard. What's that? Yeah, what is that in the middle there? What does that say?
It says JP Morgan and Company.
Yeah.
So Peugeot positioned JP Morgan at the center of this. If that's the octopus's head, and are those the tentacles coming out? Is that the way that we can think about this?
That's the way they were thinking about it. It's
Yeah.
the Peugeot committee was an investigation. And so
they were trying to show interlocking directorates where they had, banking members serving on boards of several corporations.
Well, let me just interrupt then. Doesn't this, and leave this picture up for a moment, Howard. I know anybody watching right now can't really see it. They have to get their face really close to look, but don't we still have this kind of configuration today? I mean, while it may not be JP Morgan, it might be BlackRock and Vanguard, these huge equity funds. I mean, how do we still have configurations of wealth and power that would be mapped out like we're looking at back in 1912?
Yes.
Yes.
The answer to that is a direct yes, we do.
Okay. Okay.
I wouldn't be surprised. I think it's probably much worse today.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So then let's just, good. Okay. So this is a great picture. So the Peugeot committee came out with a report, and what did they say?
Okay, I'll give you a little statistic here. They discovered that there were 180 individuals that held 341 directorships in 112 corporations. This was of the empire headed by JP Morgan. So we had, I mean, basically JP Morgan was involved in all of these 112 corporations.
Can I just jump in there, because I mentioned this before, and I learned this on another video, but that JP Morgan was itself, as a banking entity, owned by an even bigger bank.
Yeah.
Does that sound familiar?
Oh yeah, and they're owned by BlackRock today. But JP Morgan was when he died, Rockefeller famously quoted at his funeral that he controlled us all, and yet he wasn't even that rich.
So there it is, right?
As he worked for the Rothschilds family.
Okay.
Banking
So
family.
let's just be clear. When we talk about banking monetary reform and developing a sovereign money supply, your argument is it's a way to contend with the problem that's revealed in this image from 1912. In effect, I mean, right? I mean, this is, and we're going to get into some details about how do these reforms really solve the problem of a 0.001%
the problem with the
owning this
system is the money system, and the money system concentrates the wealth and power to the center.
Okay.
Which, as we see, is JP Morgan and of course Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, all those companies together own the Fed, and of course the banks control the Fed. The Fed doesn't control the banks.
So we don't see this. This is in effect hidden from we the people. I mean, right? I mean, this is,
Yeah,
we're,
this is
we're
the
pulling
hidden,
back the curtain right now.
this is the hidden hand that controls the markets.
This is the hidden hand that controls the markets. Okay, so let's finish up with Rita, because you're going to explain that the Peugeot committee did issue a report, and Congress did its duty, as it's kind of by design. However, the headline on your article says the government failed to heed the warnings of the Peugeot committee in 1913. So what did the Peugeot committee, just in a nutshell, counsel? What did Congress ignore?
Well, their report was rather lengthy, and Congress should have taken heed of the directorships that they were explaining in this report. And they also reached the conclusion that there was a system that they called banking ethics that restricted competition among the banks and the firms. And it wasn't anything in writing. It was just based upon the actions of the bankers and corporations. They seem to have this silent code among them to not compete with one another.
Oh.
And they also found some manipulation of the stock market, whereby the corporations were trying to keep other businesses from rising up. And if you think about the situation where the banks are actually loaning the money to the corporations, they're giving them the seed money to start them up. And the banks are deciding who they want to invest this money in. And then they put bankers on the board of directors. And in the meantime, they're earning a lot of interest on this money that they create. And after a while, they reach a point where they're basically controlling the corporations. And so that's about where they were at that time, and that's about where we are right now. Same thing.
So, okay.
Process was used to
So
control government.
anyway, Congress, rather than doing something to stop this, they created the Federal Reserve System through the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. And this was less than a year after this committee put out their report of the findings. And it's like they basically were, I guess that we had a rather corrupt Congress at the time, and the bankers were influential enough to get them to pass this legislation, which I presume that the bankers themselves had written.
So it's in a way, it's kind of almost an insult to our democracy that Peugeot committee comes up with recommendations, and a year later, the banking cartel brazenly dismisses. It doesn't even give it in fact, doesn't give it any time of day, and proceeds to get Congress to pass legislation which in effect cements the very warnings issued in the Peugeot committee. Is that a fair way to think about this?
Yes, it is. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And they basically created this system where the banks loan all the money or create all the money by making loans to corporations or the government or whoever, and they direct where this money goes. And I mean, that's how they control things, and they probably keep the banks owning the banks. They keep the corporations owning banks for loans that they have, and the corporations just roll over the loans and keep paying interest on them. So, they have not only the interest they have coming in from shares that they hold in the bank, but they also have the interest income.
Right. And since 1913, we've had, I mean, we don't have time to go into because I want to move kind of into the current era, but we've gone through the Great Depression. There's an attempt with the Stegall Act, these antitrust efforts. And all the efforts to reform that happened since, 1913 have been for nothing. There really hasn't. I mean, do we have reforms, or are we basically where we were in 1913 in terms of we, the people, having any sovereignty over our money supply?
I would say we have no say at all in what's going on with the money supply as far as democracy is concerned. And, and most people don't know about it. The education of the people is suppressed, so they don't learn about it. And that's the situation that we're in right now. And the whole system just defies logic, where the government has given the banks the authority to create the money and then has to turn around and loan the money back from the corporations. So this is just it's very difficult for people to grasp this idea. And, they just think the government makes and prints all the money and so forth. And I don't understand how people cannot figure this out, why the national debt keeps climbing and climbing and climbing. And this is why, because the government actually doesn't have any revenue of its own except taxes. And the taxes, a good portion are coming from the people. And the money that the people use in circulation is the same money that these banks are creating and when they make loans. So all of the money in the system right now is a result of money that the banks have loaned out to either individuals or the government.
And it's become so. I mean, so then the national debt is the consequence of. I mean, some people say that national debt isn't really a problem, because the banks can just make more money to pay off the. I mean, just in a nutshell, I don't want to go too deep in the woods on national debt, but it's a shadow on our country in some ways. I mean, right?
Well, the problem is that the debt has gone so high now. It's been in the last few years the largest expense in the budget, where I should say that it has the largest growth of the items in the budget. And it's going to reach a point where there's going to be so much interest that the government has to pay on these loans that they don't have money to do other things. And I mean, it's a situation where the debt of the government is climbing toward infinity.
So this is complicated. How does a sovereign money supply, there's a legislation that you have on the shelf that anybody could advance into Congress and say, let's pass this law. Let's say sovereign money supply was instituted pursuant to constitutional provisions, the rights of Congress to print and so on. What would happen? What impact would that have on this $1 trillion+ of national debt that's accrued over the past 100 years or whatever, since World War II?
First of all, it would stop increasing. And second of all, we would be able to pay it off as it comes due.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so this is so all of a sudden this thing that hangs over, so it could become manageable. We could resolve this issue. Okay, so that's a whole nother separate conversation that I don't want to. So hold that thought, and maybe we have time later. So in review, you guys are basically saying that there really is such a thing as a plutocracy. There really is a class. And in your article, Rita, you talk about the End Wall Street protest, and I think they called it Wall Street. What was it called?
Occupy the Fed.
Occupy the Fed.
Or no, excuse me, Occupy Wall Street. It was
Occupy Wall Street.
Yeah.
Thank you. And the the contrast was we the people and the 1%. Now, is it really the 1% that's the problem, or is it the 0.0001%? Is what we're contending with in terms of a plutocracy? And I'm just, don't answer that right now, but you're saying that a sovereign money supply with reform to banking would get us free from this usurious rent seeking that the super rich have brought to bear upon we the people. Why are you so confident that banking and monetary reform in and of itself would distribute wealth into mainstream society and solve this endless cycle of being renters on an interest debt that just gets bigger and bigger and bigger?
Well, as we often said, it doesn't fix everything. It just makes fixing everything possible. So it wouldn't fix all of that. It would make it possible to fix all of that. It would make it because now the policy-making power is in Congress instead of in the banks.
Okay. So you guys really are part of the constitutional movement of the kind of the freedom movement in our country. I mean, a lot of people that I'm talking to are, hanging a lot of their activism on the First Amendment, in this Bill of Rights, the 5 freedoms, the petitioning our grievances and assembling and publishing and speaking and choosing religion and so on. So the 4th Amendment, and others are talking about the unstated freedoms embedded in the 9th and 10th, and so on. So you're hearkening back to original constitutional provision that says Congress shall, but Congress has in effect abdicated its authority. Isn't this part of our problem?
Yes, absolutely.
Ignoring the Constitution and not taking up their responsibilities. Yeah.
And that's one of the functions of a Green Party as a minor, dissident kind of party. And this is what you see your purpose is as a committee within the Green Party, is to bring a consciousness around what do we ask for? What do we complain about as a Green Party? What grievances are we going to petition Congress and so on?
What do we need to do to fix power relations so that they serve the people and not just a few?
Okay. And that's what we're really talking about here. So this is
Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution.
This is Section 8, you say?
Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says that Congress has the power to create the money.
Right. And
So
what
Congress needs to fix it.
Yes. And to use that tool to fulfill the constitutional mandate from the preamble. The very first sentence gives us the purpose of government.
To look out for the general welfare.
Yes,
Protect the
absolutely.
general welfare.
Justice, union, domestic tranquility, etc.
And don't get me going on the 1960s assassinations, because that was nothing about domestic tranquility, only the opposite. And
Right.
I can start getting quite animated about that, but I won't.
Well, our committee right now is drafting a press release regarding the national debt.
Okay.
I mean, this national debt argument is the silliest thing on earth. We shouldn't even have a national debt. I mean, that's where we're at. And so we're trying to bring more of this to people's attention by using the argument that Congress is going through right now over the national debt.
Right.
Okay. So about Congress, national debt is a kind of a subplot in the work you're doing, because the national debt is hanging over us. Talk about the legislation that Dennis Kucinich introduced into Congress a good 20 years ago. So, the Green Party stands for, possibilities. We invite candidates to show up, run for office. There is legislation a candidate could kind of hold up and go campaign on already. There's nothing needs to be invented here. Is that correct?
Yeah, but that was like 12 years ago. It was in 2011.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, this is when Kucinich, and God, Kucinich is still alive and well and living in Cleveland, I suppose. And
Yeah, yes.
and he introduced this, but it got nowhere. So just talk about this legislation. And if there's a PDF of it, I'd love to post it on this interview site so a visitor can click on it and just see it. If that's available, I'll count on you guys to forward it to me. Talk about this legislation. What's it called? I think it goes by the acronym NEED. Is that correct?
Yeah, the NEED Act was the National Employment or Emergency Employment Defense Act. That was a title that Dennis Kucinich gave it. It was drawn from the American Monetary Reform Act, which was developed by the American Monetary Institute. And so Dennis actually was pushing that name forward because it was a response to the 2008 crash and the employment crisis that we were experiencing at the time.
Okay, so that's available. Someone could build their campaign on that legislation.
Yeah. And of course, it's been updated too by the Alliance for Just Money, who took it and just updated the findings that are in it and basically tweaked it a little bit, but just kind of updating it so that it is a current piece of legislation that could be used.
Okay, then I'm going to count on you guys to send me any link that I could embed. So the visitor, when they get the interview, they can also click and see, they'll see the covert action article, they'll see links to your CHIT committee, and I'd like to share links to the latest version of this.
It's very easy to find with a search. Just search NEED Act HR 2990. And it comes up on the .gov site and gives you a summary of it or the whole bill, whichever you want to do.
Okay. So let's return to the covert action article that Rita wrote, and what's inspiring about it is you're actually inviting left and right to unite around a banking and monetary reform. What makes monetary reform a natural issue for the left and the right to unite around? I mean, state the obvious. I mean, I need
It
help.
affects everybody. The statistics show that something like 45% of all the money that we spend to buy things goes to the banks for interest, because every step of the way from the supplier, the original maker and so forth, they're all dependent on loans from the banks to keep going. And so eventually almost half of what we spend is going to the banks for interest. And it affects everybody. And not only that, we have now this horrible wealth inequality. It's worse than it was in the Gilded Age, and much worse, I would say. And we keep creating more billionaires while the poverty rate continues to go up. And this is absolutely ridiculous. It shouldn't be happening.
Howard, can you share some perspective on this? I mean, Rita hit it, right? This is a major issue of wealth inequality and keeping people in debt.
Absolutely. In fact, it is a parasite on our economy. The money system is extracting wealth out of the production process and economic system of the nation. Whereas they keep taking the money out of it. And so there's not enough money for it to operate properly, and people have to borrow more, and they're going into debt. And of course, debt is, as the Bible says, those who lend are above those who borrow. They control them.
So we, the people of the United States of America, are in effect in those payday loans you get that you can, if you're, and sometimes they can have like 25%, high usurious interest rates. I mean, is that a fair way for us to understand kind of what's happening to, we the people as a collective? Are we subject to payday loans?
Well, that's right. That's basically how that system works, to extract the wealth and concentrate it to the few. And we want a system that distributes the wealth broadly. The current system is described as centripetal, and like a hurricane, it violently forces everything to the center. The power and the wealth and everything goes to the center, whereas in a centrifugal system, it's spread out broadly. And that's what we want.
Then speak to that. How, just in a practical, so that we, the people watching, understand if these reform principles that you are proponents, that you're advocating, functionally, practically, what does that look like? I mean, we're still going to have banks. We're still going to have people working, making money.
Yeah, we don't want to put anybody out of business. We just want to change their business model. As you mentioned before, banks don't compete. We want them to compete. We want them to compete at the level of what the interest they will pay on a deposit. They will no longer be able to create deposits. They will only be able to be intermediaries for deposits of people. And so that becomes more what is traditionally what people believe the banking business is, that they lend existing money. And of course, that's not what the system we have is, but that's what it should be. And that makes an honest banking business. Okay, so it's not the big, powerful over everybody kind of thing. In fact, communities used to have their local banks. They were just a member of the community, the banker was. They weren't over the top until you got into the Potters and stuff like that, those people.
So, and very, very briefly, we are wrapping up. Distinguish a public bank from the monetary reforms, because a public bank is in some ways only as good as the reformed money supply. Is that, there's two currents here, because I hear people in the Green Party side, we actually promote public banking.
Yeah.
But that's only good if something else is in place. Is that correct?
Well, public banking is good in any case, because it would be publicly controlled. I'm for, publicly controlling that. The deposits of the city or the state or whatever is operating, so they would be able to give them a low interest and, a much better deal than the private banks are willing to do. But the banks control the current monetary system, so the commercial private banks. And so there's a limit to what you can do. So when people say that public banking is the solution, I have to say, well, no, it's not the solution. It's something that's good, but it's not the solution, because the banks would still be able to overpower them. And of course, with the politics, they could probably eliminate them or even keep them from happening.
Okay. Now, let's just talk about this left-right coalition. And this is what Rita touches on and wraps up in her covert action news article, which will be posted here. What are other issues that could bring this left-right together and overcome divisions? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, do you see other issues on the horizon that are with us today that could conceivably overcome the left-right divide and build a unity movement? Each of you, just off the top of your head, just share out.
It's the economy, stupid.
I've heard that before.
That's right. And that's the thing that brings people together. I mean, the Ku Klux Klan and the Black Panthers worked together one time on an issue, an economic issue for pay for workers, and they united to get some legislation to help those workers out. And that's the kind of thing that we need, is that everybody wants a fair system. Everybody wants to live in a safe neighborhood. Everybody wants to live in prosperity. Well, let's make it.
Rita, do you have a thought?
Well, you know, the wars right now are starting to be a left-right issue. They're not just the left anymore. You know, we're in a state of perpetual war, and this is very, very, very lucrative for the banks. You know,
Right.
that's why we have the wars, and we need to remove this profit motive from all of the investments and set up a system where the needs of the people are met and are more important than profits. And basically, that's what we need to do. And
Yeah,
Okay.
climate change is the other issue also. Now, I don't know if everybody on the right agrees about the climate change, but I think they'll come around to that as we continue to have problems. So, you know, we need to do something about that also. And that's something that affects everybody.
Well, and the climate change is very complicated because there are climate denialists who are
Mhm.
saying that the climate change has been kind of seized upon by the plutocracy to manipulate society.
well,
And
there isn't an issue that they wouldn't seize upon to try and make profitable.
Right, yes.
I don't think there's any issue that they wouldn't.
Yeah, they have some special name they give to these investments that they claim
Right.
are supposed to help the climate change issue, but you know, and I can't remember the name they put on it. I actually wrote an article about it. Anyway,
That's the sustainability movement, I know is
Mostly about public relations.
right. Okay, well, you know, one of my other questions is let's end with this and we'll wrap up and we're going to end. Obviously, this needs to be taught in our high school civics class, but is it too controversial? Could this ever be introduced into a public school, private school curriculum? I mean, is that conceivable, or is it just something that's going to have to be kind of discussed on the off Main Street media, like Covert Action?
Well, certainly after we get monetary reform, we can be teaching monetary science in schools. It's been expunged from the entire system by the banks because they don't want people to know. They don't even want their economists to know
Okay.
how the system works. And
Well,
so
it needs
that's
to be
what it is.
taught.
I think what the difference is, a big difference is going to be is the psychological consequences of money. When it's usury money, you get alienation, you get hyper individualism, you get that selfishness, you get the leave me alone, I'm not going to help you, don't help, I'm, you know, that whole kind of attitude, that for-profit mindset that is in there comes from the money system. And that by changing the money system, we can reverse that. And instead of an economics of greed, we would have an economics of care. The first cause of money makes the difference. So if the first cause is for profit, you have a for-profit society, which is just out for profit for themselves, you know, personal gain. Whereas money issued for care, for the general welfare, would psychologically make people more caring.
And you just hooked us back into the preamble of the Constitution.
Right.
That our money supply needs to go back to the roots of what this preamble or the purpose of our Constitution stands for.
Right.
Looking out for the general welfare. Rita, do you want to give us a closing thought? And then we're going to end our interview. And I just want to say the Banking Monetary Reform Committee, Green Party US, I'm really happy about the work you're doing. I'm excited that we had an opportunity to talk. This is important work. It's wonky. It's above a little bit my head, but what we're trying to do is ground it in some practical understandings of And I think the idea of becoming owners of the money supply instead of renters is something that I can understand. Rita, what's your final thought from you?
My final thought is there should be no such thing as a national debt. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's such a simple idea that the government should not give banks the right to create money and then loan it back from them. It's absolutely absurd.
And that's what we're looking at reforming and changing.
Yes.
And we have plans to do that. Thank you both very much. I'm going to sign off that my name's Chuck and I'm working with an organization called Truth Action Project. And we are committed to, exploring political truths, and certainly what you've done today to explain our money supply, the problems with it. You have pulled back the curtains, and I hope the visitors who watched us today have learned more about making important reforms. Howard, Rita, thank you both very much. Bye.
Okay,
You can turn the recording off.
I did.
Okay.
Oh,
Hey.
no. It says it's still recording. I hit the stop button.
Well, stop it again.